The man didn't hesitate. Arthur Pendleton trusted, decorated, loyal for 16 years, pressed 2 fingers to his earpiece and turned away from the screaming crowd. Around him, masked gunmen were forcing Manhattan's wealthiest to their knees at gunpoint. Champagne glasses shattered on marble. Women clutched each other. Men with net worths in the billions were begging, and Arthur just stood there in his tailored tuxedo, calmly relaying positions to the attackers, like he was reading a grocery list. Genevieve Sinclair watched it all from behind a service door she'd cracked open 2 inches no more, no less, and felt her stomach drop straight through the floor. 8 months undercover. 8 months of lying about her name, her past, her reasons for being in rooms like this one. 8 months of building a case that could bring down one of the most sophisticated financial crime operations on the eastern seaboard. And in 30 seconds, she'd watched the whole thing turn inside out. If you've ever been the only person in a room who knows the truth, you know exactly what that feels like. That particular cold that starts in your chest and spreads outward until your fingers go numb. Before this night is over, Genevieve will have to make a choice that no amount of federal training prepares you for, and so will the man who should have ordered her killed. If this kind of story keeps you up at night, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning of the worst and most important night of Genevieve Sinclair's life. The invitation had come through her cover identity, Genevieve Marlowe, independent financial consultant, 3 years of fabricated client history, 1 very expensive dress she'd expensed to a federal account under the line item operational attire. The Hargrove Foundation annual gala, $5,000 a plate. A ballroom full of people who moved money, the way other people moved furniture constantly, quietly, always to somewhere more convenient. She'd worked galas before. They were useful that way. Nobody looks twice at a woman in an evening gown studying the room. They assume you're bored, or looking for your husband, or calculating who's worth talking to. They never assume you're calculating exit routes. The Meridian Hotel ballroom was the kind of room that made you feel smaller just by standing in it. 40-foot ceilings with chandeliers that probably cost more than most people's houses. String quartet in the far corner, playing something Genevieve vaguely recognized but couldn't name. Round tables draped in ivory linen, centerpieces that looked like they'd been designed by someone who'd never seen a flower growing in the wild. She'd arrived at 7:15, 90 minutes before her target was scheduled to appear. Standard protocol. She liked having the geography settled in her body before anything important started, knew where the service corridors were, which waitstaff were actually waitstaff, which security detail belonged to the venue, and which belonged to private contractors. The Hargrove Foundation had 3 of Lucian Vescari's men on site. She'd clocked 2 of them in the first 20 minutes. The third she'd found by accident near the coat check, which told her something about how he was positioned in the hierarchy, good enough to be trusted in the field, not experienced enough to choose a better vantage point. Arthur Pendleton had arrived at 8:40. She'd noticed him the way she always noticed Arthur, with a kind of careful attention she disguised as something else. He was one of those men who occupied a room without seeming to try. 50s, silver-haired, the kind of face that read as patrician from across a ballroom and as calculating up close. He'd been with Vescari's organization for 16 years. She knew his file the way she knew her own social security number. Clean on paper. $40 million discrepancy in the accounts she'd been building a cake on for the better part of a year. She'd positioned herself near the bar, sipping sparkling water she wasn't drinking, watching Arthur work the room. He was good at it. Moved from cluster to cluster, laughed at the right moments, touched elbows instead of hands, deliberate intimacy without the mess of actual warmth. 2 of the men he spoke to were board members of a Vescari-adjacent real estate holding company. One was a federal judge whose name appeared twice, in files she wasn't supposed to have accessed. She'd noted all of it. Lucian Vescari arrived at 9:10. She felt the shift in the room before she saw him. It was the kind of thing you couldn't explain easily, the way certain people air differently from everyone else. Conversations shortened, postures straightened. The string quartet seemed to play slightly more carefully. He was taller than she'd expected. She'd seen photographs, surveillance footage, two separate occasions when she'd been in proximity, but not in direct sightline. None of it had prepared her for the actual version. He moved through the room like a man who had never once in his life needed to wonder whether he belonged somewhere. Dark suit, no tie, the kind of ease that wasn't casual so much as settled. Like someone who'd been comfortable in his own skin for so long that the question had stopped being interesting. It meant he did not look in her direction. She exhaled. She was 6 conversations away from his position, surrounded by people, holding a glass, dressed like 50 other women in the room. She was fine. She was covered. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing, which was standing very still and observing while an encrypted recording device, the size of a thumbnail, logged everything within a 12-foot radius. Then, at 9:47, the lights went out. Not a flicker. Not a momentary brownout from overtaxed circuits. Complete, immediate, total darkness, the kind that drops every conversation in a room to zero, because for a half second, no one is sure whether to panic yet, kind engineered to disorient. Then the doors burst open. She moved before she fully processed what was happening. 8 years of field training, and it still surprised her, the way the body took over. She was already angling sideways, away from the crowd's instinct to bunch together, when the flashlights came on. 6 of them, mounted on tactical rifles, sweeping the room in controlled arcs. Nobody moves. Hands where we can see them. The voice was calm. That was the most frightening part. Not the weapons. Calm. She made the service door in 11 seconds. It was unlocked. She'd checked it at 7:35 and had been counting on nobody relocking it in the intervening 2 hours, which was a reasonable bet in a venue where the catering staff were moving in and out all night. She pressed herself into the gap, got it to 2 inches, and stopped, because Arthur Pendleton was standing 12 feet away, facing the nearest gunman, and he was not afraid. She'd seen people face armed men before. She knew what that looked like, the stillness that isn't courage but shock, the way the body locks, because the nervous system can't process what's happening fast enough to tell the muscles what to do. That wasn't what she was seeing. Arthur was talking, low, controlled, with his hands at his sides rather than raised. The gunman nodded twice. Arthur touched 2 fingers to his earpiece and turned a quarter turn, and Genevieve watched him speak a word she couldn't hear into the device, then hold up 4 fingers, then point toward the north wall where she knew, from her earlier survey, the building's security relay panel was located. She stopped breathing. The scene rearranged itself in her mind the way evidence always did, when something broke a case open, not slowly, piece by piece, but all at once, a controlled demolition of everything she'd assumed was solid. Arthur hadn't been caught in this attack. Arthur had planned it. She was still working through the implications when she heard the footstep directly behind her. "I'd recommend not moving." The voice was quiet. No inflection she could identify as fear or anger. Just a statement of fact, the way you'd say the weather was turning. She went very still. Turn around slowly. Both hands visible. She turned. Lucien Vescari was standing in the service corridor, 3 feet from her, without a weapon drawn, looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not rage, not the cold calculation she'd expected. Something she couldn't name yet, which bothered her more than the alternative. Behind him, one of his men held a small device signal detector, the kind that swept for transmitters. The device's indicator light was red, her recording device. The understanding arrived fully formed and terrible. He'd been sweeping his own guest list for surveillance equipment, which meant he'd been expecting a problem tonight, which meant he'd known something was coming, even if he hadn't known exactly what. "Your name," he said. "Genevieve Marlowe." The cover name came out clean. 8 months of practice. "Your real name." She held his gaze and said nothing. He looked at her for a moment, 3 seconds, maybe 4, which is longer than it sounds when someone is looking at you, the way he was looking at her. Then he said, "Arthur is going to require that you be eliminated. He can't afford a witness who was close enough to the service door to see what he just did." She didn't let herself react. "I am going to offer you an alternative," Lucien said. "You're going to take it." From the ballroom, she could hear voices, someone crying. A man trying to negotiate in the blundering way People who'd never needed to negotiate for anything important tried to negotiate. The armed men moving through the space. The clock inside her chest counting seconds. What alternative, she said. He took a single step toward her and said, in the same unhurried tone he'd used for everything else, "You're going to walk out there beside me. You're going to look like you belong next to me. And when Arthur asks who you are, I'm going to tell him you're my fiancé." Stared at him. "You've been in this room all night," he continued. "You arrived early. You've been watching positions, mapping exits, clocking my security. You're not a civilian. You're also not one of Arthur's people if you were. He'd have positioned you somewhere more useful." His eyes moved across her face with the same systematic attention she'd been using on the room all night. "Whatever you are, you're not the problem I need to manage tonight. Arthur is outside sirens, building in the distance, getting closer. That's police response," Lucian said. "Which means we have approximately 6 minutes before this becomes a scene nobody controls. You can step out through that service door and try to disappear, in which case Arthur's men will find you before you reach the street. Or you walk beside me." Genevieve thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that this was exactly the kind of situation they couldn't train you for. The ones where every protocol collapsed and you were left with nothing but instinct and whatever you actually were underneath all the preparation. She thought about what her supervisor, Thomas Kessler, would tell her to do. She thought about 8 months of work. She thought about the $40 million and the financial records she still hadn't fully mapped, and the judge's name in those files, and Arthur Pendleton's 2 fingers pressed to his earpiece, while masked men aimed rifles at the wealthiest people in Manhattan. "Walk," she said. The transition happened fast. Lucian moved first, back toward the ballroom, and she fell into position beside him, without being told where to stand left side, slight behind, close enough to suggest intimacy without blocking his peripheral vision. She registered, distantly, that she'd taken the position instinctively, and that he registered that she had. The ballroom was chaos with a structure to it. The gunmen were organized. Methodical, this wasn't robbery. She understood now. It was demonstration, a show of force. Arthur sending a message to whoever needed to receive it. She clocked 4 gunmen on the floor level, 2 near the exits, 1 maintaining position near the north wall panel. Everyone with a weapon knew where they were supposed to be. The guests did not know where they were supposed to be. They'd clustered near the tables, some seated, some standing, 1 elderly man in the corner, who seemed to be having a cardiac event that nobody was addressing because everyone was too afraid to move. She noted it and filed it. If she got through the next 20 minutes, she was flagging that to the first paramedic on scene. Arthur saw them before they'd crossed half the room. His face changed. She watched it happen, the microflash of surprise, immediately controlled, replaced by something harder and more watchful. He was good. Most people wouldn't have caught the transition. She'd spent 8 years learning to catch it. He walked toward them, and the gunman nearest him drifted 2 steps in the same direction without being asked, which told her something about the operational structure of tonight's plan. Lucian. Arthur's voice was social, concerned. A man encountering his employer in a crisis. "I've been trying to reach you." "Where were you?" "Managing," Lucian said. He put his hand at the small of Genevieve's back. The touch was deliberate, positioned, sending in information rather than expressing anything. She made herself not stiffen. Arthur's eyes moved to her. "Who is this?" "Genevieve," Lucian said, "my fiancée." The word landed in the space between the 3 of them and sat there. She watched Arthur process it. The calculation was visible only in the small muscles around his eyes, the way they tightened slightly, then released. He was recalculating, checking his own inventory of what he knew about Lucian's personal life, whether this was consistent with information he had, whether this woman could be verified or dismissed. "I wasn't aware." "Nobody was," Lucian said. "We've been careful." He glanced at Arthur with an expression she couldn't read completely, not warmth, not confrontation, something balanced at the precise edge between them. She was near the service corridor when it said, frightened. She made herself look frightened. It wasn't entirely acting her adrenaline. Adrenaline was running at a level that made her hands want to shake, and she let them shake slightly, channeling the real thing into something that looked like civilian fear rather than operational stress. Arthur studied her. She could feel it, the specific quality of someone's attention when they are deciding whether you are a problem. Of course, he said finally. Of course she should be with you. He touched Lucian's arm, a gesture that was 9/10 reassurance and 1/10 something else. I'm glad you're both safe. The sirens outside had gotten close enough that the light through the high windows was cycling blue-red. Arthur turned toward the gunman, and she watched him, Lucian's hand still at her back, the warmth of it more anchoring than she wanted to admit. Watched Arthur give a signal that was barely a signal at all, just a tilt of his head, and watched the gunmen begin their withdrawal. Efficient, coordinated, like a rehearsed exit, like something that had been planned well in advance by someone who knew exactly how long they had. The police came through the main entrance 40 seconds later. She stood beside Lucian Vascari while uniformed officers swept the room, and plainclothes detectives began the process of separating witnesses from each other. She gave a statement that was technically accurate and contained nothing useful. She said her name was Genevieve Marlowe. She said she'd been near the back of the room when the lights went out. She said she hadn't seen the attackers' faces clearly. All of it true. None of it what she knew. Lucian's hand dropped from her back the moment the police entered, which she noted he wasn't performing for them, only for Arthur. Filed that too, in the part of her mind that was still working the case, even while the rest of her was managing the reality of standing inside it. At some point during the detective's questions, she looked up and found Lucian watching her from across the room. He wasn't pretending not to. He was simply looking at her, with that same unidentifiable expression, as if she were a problem he'd decided to keep rather than solve. She looked back. She had 6 minutes before the police separated them, and she was already calculating what she needed. Because one thing was clear, in the wreckage of what should have been a routine surveillance operation, in the middle of a ballroom full of frightened billionaires, and arriving police, and a man she'd spent 8 months building a case against who had just told her the truth. Genevieve Sinclair wasn't walking out of this building free. She was walking into something she didn't have a name for yet. And Arthur Pendleton, who'd been calmly directing armed men while his employer's guests knelt on a marble floor, was watching her from near the east exit with eyes that had finished their calculation. She could read the result. He'd decided she was a problem. He wasn't wrong. The only question that mattered now, was whether the man who'd put his hand at her back and called her his fiancé had any idea what kind of problem she actually was, and whether, when he found out, it would change anything at all. Police kept them for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Genevieve counted every one of them. The detective assigned to her was a woman named Caruso Compact, tired-looking, with the particular brand of patience that came from years of interviewing people who were lying to her. She sat across from Genevieve at one of the gala tables, a small recorder between them, and asked the same questions 4 different ways. While around them the ballroom was being documented, photographed, measured. Genevieve answered each version of the same question with the same answer, which is what you did when the answer was true. Consistency under repetition is easy when you're not manufacturing anything. What she was manufacturing was the expression. The slightly glazed quality of someone who'd had a bad night. The occasional pause before answering, like she was still processing. The way she kept her hands folded in her lap to hide that they'd stopped shaking 20 minutes ago, because a woman genuinely in shock doesn't recover that cleanly. Detective Caruso had noticed. Genevieve could tell by the way her eyes dropped to those folded hands twice during the questioning. But noticing and being able to do anything about it were different problems. And Caruso didn't have enough to push harder. When they released her, Lucian was waiting near the main entrance. Not obviously. He was talking to one of his own attorneys, a man who'd appeared within 40 minutes of the police arrival, which told Genevieve something about how Vascari's operation was structured in terms of legal response. But he was positioned so that she would have to pass within 10 feet of him to reach the exit, and when she did, he ended his conversation mid-sentence and fell into step beside her. "My car is outside," he said. "I have my own transportation." "No," he said. "You don't." He didn't look at her when he said it. Just kept walking, steady, unhurried, like a man who wasn't concerned about whether she followed because he already knew she would. "Arthur had someone on your vehicle 20 minutes after the police arrived. Whatever you drove here, assume it's been inventoried." She kept walking, Process that. You had someone watching Arthur's people, she said. I've been watching Arthur for 6 weeks. She filed that. 6 weeks. The timeline mattered. They went through the main doors and into the Manhattan night, and the cold hit her, the way cold always hit. After extended adrenaline, sudden and total, like the temperature had been waiting for her to let her guard down. She didn't let herself shiver. Not yet. His car was a dark sedan, no markings, idling at the curb with a driver who didn't turn around when they got in. Partition between front and back was up before the door closed. They sat in silence for 3 blocks. Then Lucian said, "How long have you been federal?" Turned her head and looked at him. His profile in the passing streetlights was composed. No satisfaction in the question, no performance of having caught her. Just the question itself, asked like a man who'd been waiting for the appropriate moment to ask it and had decided this was that moment. I don't know what you. The recording device was military-grade compression technology, civilian inaccessible, which means government-issued or stolen from government supply. And you don't have the profile of someone who steals from government supply. He didn't look at her. The way you moved when the lights went out, that's not a frightened person finding a wall to stand against. That's trained lateral movement toward a predetermined exit. You'd already mapped the service corridor. A pause. And you've been inside rooms connected to my organization 3 times in the past 4 months. Different names each time. Different presentation. But the eyes are consistent. She was quiet for a moment. You've seen me before. Twice. Once at the Delancey Club in February, you were introduced as a wealth management consultant from Boston. Once at a private dinner in March, you were attached to a venture capital group from Chicago. He turned and looked at her then. I have a good memory for people who are paying more attention than they're supposed to be. Car moved uptown. Outside, the city carried on its indifferent business. What do you want? She asked. Right now, I want to know what you have on Arthur. She nearly laughed. The audacity of it, the complete undecorated directness of a man who'd said the fastest path between 2 points, was the only one worth taking. You want me to hand you my federal investigation. I want to know what you've documented, because you've been inside the financial architecture of this organization for 8 months, and you've seen things I haven't been able to see from my position. He said it without apology. Arthur has been stealing from me for 4 years. I have suspicions and gaps. You have records, and if I tell you I have nothing, then you're lying, and we'll get to that. He looked at her, steadily. I'd rather skip it. The car turned onto a private street in Tribeca that she recognized. She'd mapped it 6 weeks ago, part of the perimeter survey of Vescari's primary residential property. The building ahead was unremarkable from the street, which was entirely deliberate. I'm not going in there, she said. You're not a prisoner. Then tell your driver to stop. Lucian said nothing. Car didn't stop. She looked at the door handle, calculated the speed, decided against it, not because she was afraid of the fall, but because hitting pavement at 30 miles an hour in an evening gown was an operational problem. She didn't need added to her current list. If I don't check in within 2 hours, she said, people will come looking. I know. That's why you have 2 hours to decide what to tell them. The building's private entrance swallowed the car, and the door behind them closed. Penthouse was not what she'd expected, which annoyed her because she'd been building a mental model of it for weeks based on structural data and property records. And she didn't like having her models disrupted. It was large without being excessive, the furniture chosen for use rather than display, the windows covering the south wall from floor to ceiling in a way that turned Manhattan into something almost abstract, books that looked read rather than arranged, a kitchen that showed actual evidence of cooking. No art she recognized as trophy purchases. It looked, disconcertingly, like somewhere a person actually lived. She stood near the windows while Lucian poured 2 glasses of water, not scotch, not wine, water, and set one on the table in her direction without bringing it to her. One of his men positioned himself near the entrance. She counted 2 more she could identify from sound and movement. At least 1 more she couldn't locate yet. Tell me about the accounts, Lucian said. Tell me what you know about Arthur, she said. He considered her for a moment. Then he sat down, and she understood the gesture he was taking himself below her eye level, which was a deliberate concession. A signal that this was going to be a conversation and not an interrogation. She didn't sit, but she stopped calculating the window distance. 6 weeks ago, he said, I found an anomaly in a quarterly disbursement report, $12,000. Not a significant number in the context of our operation, but it had been moved in a specific pattern, fractured into subamounts, cycled through 3 shell accounts, assembled. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. It was clean. If I hadn't been looking at that specific line item for a different reason, I'd never have seen it. You saw it. I traced it back 8 months. The pattern existed before that, but 8 months is as far as I got before tonight. He paused. The total across that period is somewhere north of 4 million. Closer to 40, she said. He was quiet. She watched his face and saw something move through it, not surprise exactly, but the recalibration of a man who'd been looking at a corner of a painting and just had the lights turned on for the full canvas. 40 million, he said, over 4 years, routed through 7 shell companies across 3 jurisdictions. 2 of them are dormant but legally maintained, which means someone with real corporate law infrastructure has been working this. She stopped. She just handed him operational information from an active federal investigation, which was a thing she was absolutely not authorized to do, and she'd done it because the alternative was knowing less than she needed to know. She'd examine the ethics of that later, when she had somewhere private to do it. Who's the infrastructure? Lucian asked. I don't know yet. That's what the last 4 months have been. You were going to take it to indictment without knowing who built the shell system? I was building toward it. These things take time. Arthur doesn't have institutional patience, Lucian said. He would have needed someone sophisticated, someone outside the organization. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him working it the same way she worked problems, systematically, pulling at threads. There's a name, a facilitator who adjacent to several operations I know of, never directly connected, goes by arrangement only. I've never been able to identify him fully. What do you know? That he has government contacts? He said it with a flatness that told her he'd been sitting with that particular discomfort for a while, which is why I never pushed harder on identifying him. If you pull a thread that connects to a government official and you don't know what else is attached to it, you could pull down something that lands on you, she finished. Yes. She picked up the water glass, drank, bought herself 3 seconds. Tonight wasn't a robbery, she said. No. It was a demonstration. For the council, there's a council. I've tracked the meeting structure. I know there are 6 to 8 primary stakeholders above your organizational level who have oversight authority. Lucian said nothing, which was confirmation. Arthur was sending them a message that you're vulnerable, that control of the organization should be reconsidered. She set the glass down. The problem is that I saw him do it, which means I'm the only witness who can corroborate that the attack was internal rather than external. Which is why he wants you dead, Lucian said simply. Which is why he wants me dead. They looked at each other across the room. The engagement announcement, she said, tonight was improvised, entirely, and your people will back it up. My people will say whatever I tell them to say. No arrogance in it, just fact. Arthur's problem now is that moving against you moves against me, and doing that in front of the council tonight would have confirmed everything they already suspect about his ambitions. He's patient. He'll wait for a cleaner moment. How long does that buy me? Days. Maybe a week. He met her eyes, which is the same amount of time. I have to build something solid enough to take to the council before Arthur builds his own case. Her phone buzzed in her clutch. She looked at it. Kessler, her supervisor. 7 missed calls across the last 2 hours, which she'd silenced during police questioning. Now a text. Where are you? Call immediately. She looked up and found Lucian watching her phone. I need to make a call, she said. There's a room at the end of the hall. Private. She walked toward it, and she was aware of him not following, which told her either he trusted her enough to let her communicate with her own chain of command, or he had the room wired and didn't need to follow. Probably both. She closed the door and called Kessler. He picked up on the first ring. Sinclair. His voice was tight in a way she hadn't heard before. Talk to me. I'm secure. Operational status is complicated. Where are you? I can't confirm location right now. A pause. Short and specific, like a man choosing his next words carefully. Are you with Vescari? The question landed wrong. Too direct. Too preloaded with the answer he expected. How do you know about Vescari's involvement tonight? She asked. The gala wasn't public knowledge yet. NYPD was still locking down the scene. Press didn't have it. We've been monitoring. Monitoring what? The operation wasn't under Vescari, it was… She stopped. Kessler waited. She thought about Arthur Pendleton's 2 fingers on his earpiece. The government contacts Lucian had mentioned. The shell company infrastructure sophisticated enough to hide $40 million across 4 years. She thought about the specific way Kessler had asked, "Are you with Vescari?" Not "Are you safe?" Not "What's your status?" Not any of the questions a supervisor asks when an undercover operative goes dark during a field incident. "Are you with Vescari?" Like a man confirming a target's location. Sinclair. Kessler's voice was careful now. She could hear the quality of it shift the adjustment a person makes when they realize the conversation has gone sideways from where they planned. You need to listen to me. What happened tonight changes the operational picture significantly. I need you to secure whatever evidence you've collected and bring it out. Tonight, we'll arrange extraction. You knew about the attack, she said. Silence. You knew Arthur was planning something tonight. That's how you knew to ask about Vescari. You knew they'd interact. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that, the steadiness, even while something cold and structural was collapsing inside her chest. How long have you known about Arthur's play? That's not… How long, Thomas? The silence this time was longer, and in its length she had her answer. She ended the call. She stood in the quiet room for approximately 30 seconds, looked at the wall, looked at her phone, looked at 8 months of work and the specific way it had just rearranged itself into something she didn't recognize. Kessler had known, which meant the things she'd been building, the case, the records, the painstaking construction of financial evidence across 3 jurisdictions, hadn't been investigation. It had been managed. Someone had been managing her, keeping her inside the operation, keeping her close to Vescari's financial architecture, while Arthur used the time to position his own play. She was not a federal investigator who had gotten caught inside a criminal organization tonight. She was a loose end. She went back to the main room. Lucian looked at her when she entered, and something in her face told him something, because he set down what he was holding and gave her his full attention. Kessler knew about tonight, she said, my supervisor. He knew what Arthur was planning. Lucian was very still. He tried to get me to bring him the evidence and come in for extraction. She heard her own voice flat, controlled, the sound of someone who has not yet fully processed what they're saying. He knew to ask whether I was with you, specifically, not whether I was safe. Your name directly. Arthur has someone inside your agency, Lucian said. Arthur has my supervisor. She sat down. For the first time all night, she actually sat down because her legs had decided they'd done enough. 8 months. I've been feeding reports up the chain for 8 months, and every one of those reports went through Kessler. So Arthur's known your investigation as it developed. He's known everything. The accounts I'd identified, the shell structure I was mapping, how close I was getting. She pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum where the tightness had concentrated itself. Tonight wasn't just about removing you from power. He needed me gone, too. I was going to get too close to the infrastructure, and if I documented it fully, you'd have found Kessler in it, Lucian said. She looked at him. Facilitator I mentioned, he said slowly. Government contacts. Running shell structure sophisticated enough to hide this for 4 years. He was working it in real time, and she could see the moment it resolved. Your supervisor isn't working for Arthur. They're partners. Arthur needed the financial infrastructure. Kessler needed Arthur's access to run the operation without oversight. $40 million. 2 men. And she'd been the investigation they'd been using to monitor their own exposure close enough to see threats, far enough from the center, that she couldn't document the people at it. I can't go back, she said. It wasn't a question. If you go back to Kessler, you hand him confirmation of everything you figured out. Tonight. He'll bury you in procedure administrative leave. Investigation of your conduct. The recording device was unauthorized. Fake engagement is a violation of protocol. He has enough to sideline you for months while he and Arthur clean up. Lucian's voice was even. He wasn't telling her anything she hadn't already arrived at herself. He was just willing to say it plainly, which was something. And if he decides procedure isn't fast enough, I know what that means. Then you understand your options. She looked at her hands. The shaking had come back, real this time, not performed. The specific tremor of someone whose nervous system had absorbed too much in too short a time and was beginning to send invoices. She hated that he could see it. "What's yours?" she said. "What?" "Your option. You could hand me to Arthur tonight. Tell him you found a federal agent. You've neutralized the threat. Goodwill restored." She looked up. "It would buy you something with the council." He looked at her for a long moment. "It would, but you're not going to." "No." "Why?" He was quiet for a beat. Then he said, "Because Arthur is going to move against me within the week, regardless of what I hand him. Handing him you would be a gesture, not a solution." He picked up his water glass. "And because the evidence you've built, the 40 million, the shell structure, the 4 years of theft, that's not something I can reconstruct from my position. You've already done the work." It was honest. She appreciated that it was honest, even if the honesty was entirely strategic. "We'd have to appear convincing," she said. "Yes. To Arthur. To the council. To whoever Kessler has watching the situation. Yes. And you'd have to trust that I won't document everything I find in your penthouse and submit it to whatever federal authority I can reach that isn't compromised. I'd have to trust that," he said. "And you'd have to trust that I won't hand you to Arthur. The moment keeping you becomes more expensive than losing you." He set the glass down. "Neither of us has a better option tonight." She breathed in, breathed out. "I want access to your financial records." He didn't blink. Specific access. The accounts Arthur would have touched. The disbursement structures from the last 4 years. "I need to corroborate what I have externally with what you have internally. Because right now, my evidence is built from the outside, and Arthur's defense will be that it's fabricated or misinterpreted." She held his gaze. "If I can cross-reference with your internal documentation, it becomes something a jury can't dismiss." "A jury," he said. "You're still thinking about prosecution." "I'm always thinking about prosecution." He considered her for a long moment. Outside, Manhattan carried on sirens somewhere. Always sirens. The city's constant reminder that nothing that happened inside any building was the only thing happening. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll need you documented in this building tonight. Building access, staff confirmation. The engagement needs paper, not just my word. I need clothes. I'll have something sent. I need my actual identification." "Which one?" She looked at him. "You've been Marlowe for 8 months, he said. "Who were you before that?" She thought about what it cost to say it. Thought about Kessler's voice on the phone. The careful adjustment when the conversation went wrong. 8 months of careful management. "Sinclair," she said. "Genevieve Sinclair." He nodded, like he was filing it, like it was information he'd treat with whatever the opposite of carelessness was. "Get some sleep," he said. "We have a great deal of work to do before Arthur decides his timeline." She stood. "I'm not your fiancé." "No," he agreed. "You're not. What I am is a federal investigator with a compromised chain of command inside a criminal organization's primary residence, with documented evidence of financial fraud, a witness account of a coordinated armed attack, and no one in my agency I can currently trust." She said it clearly, like an inventory. "That's what you're working with." "I know what I'm working with," Lucien said. She walked toward the room he'd indicated earlier and stopped with her hand on the doorframe. "Kessler will make a move," she said. "When he realizes I'm not coming in tonight, he'll escalate. He has to. I know too much now." "Yes, which means we have less time than you said." Lucien looked at her across the room, and for just a moment, one unguarded half-second, she saw something in his face that wasn't calculation or strategy or the particular composure of a man who managed dangerous situations for a living. He was tired, not physically, the other kind. The kind that accumulated across years of being the person who decided things, trusted the wrong people, and paid for it with the kind of currency you couldn't recover. "Less time," he agreed. "Which means we start at 6. She went into the room and closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark without taking off her shoes. Because taking off her shoes felt like a decision, she wasn't ready to make yet a small concession to the idea that she was staying. That this was where she was. That the woman who'd walked into the Meridian Hotel tonight as a federal operative was not the same woman who would walk out. Outside the door, she heard Lucien moving, the quiet efficiency of a man who slept less than he needed to and had made his peace with it. Her phone had 30% battery, and Kessler's number in the recent calls, and 8 months of encrypted field notes. She no longer knew who to send them to. She did not sleep. At 4:47 in the morning, a notification appeared on her phone, a secondary alert system she'd set up outside official channels, tied to a financial monitoring flag she'd planted deep in one of the shell account structures 6 weeks ago. The account was being liquidated. Whoever was running the cleanup had started already, which meant Kessler wasn't waiting to see if she'd come in. He'd already decided she wasn't going to. The account liquidation had started at 4:47 a.m. By 5:12, Genevieve had traced it through 3 relay points. She was sitting on the floor of the guest room, with her back against the bed frame and her phone on her knee, working through the monitoring interface she'd built into a secondary encrypted app that Kessler had never known existed. The room was dark except for the screen glow. Her heels were still on. She'd told herself she wasn't staying, and some part of her had taken that literally, and now her feet ached in a way she was ignoring because the ache was less important than what she was reading. The account being liquidated was a holding structure she'd flagged 6 weeks ago, a Cayman-registered entity named Peloros Consulting Group that existed only as a legal address and a routing number. She'd planted the monitoring flag inside a financial compliance database she had legitimate access to as part of her cover, the kind of flag that was invisible unless you were looking for it specifically. She'd never reported it to Kessler. Some operational instinct she hadn't fully understood at the time had told her to keep it separate. That instinct was the only reason she had anything now. Peloros was being emptied into 2 downstream accounts, both new registrations, both created in the last 6 hours. Whoever was running was fast. Whoever was running the cleanup, and they were thorough, and they knew exactly what they were doing, which confirmed everything she'd arrived at last night. This wasn't panicked reaction. This was a prepared contingency plan that had existed before tonight, waiting for the moment it was needed. She photographed every screen, documented the timestamps, the routing codes, the downstream account numbers, before they could be cycled further. At 5:30, she knocked on the door of Lucian's study. He was already awake. Of course he was. He was sitting behind a desk that had 3 separate monitors arranged in a configuration she recognized as financial analysis software. And the man who'd been positioned near the entrance had been replaced by a different man who looked like he'd been awake longer than anyone in the building. Lucian looked up when she entered. His eyes went to the phone in her hand. "They're liquidating," she said. "It started while I was sitting in there. Peloros Consulting Group, that's one of the shell entities I'd flagged. Cayman registered, 4 years old. It's being drained into 2 new accounts right now." He held his hand out for the phone. She hesitated 1 beat long enough to acknowledge to herself that she was handing a federal device with operational data to a criminal organization's principal, then gave it to him. He looked at the screen. His jaw tightened once, briefly. "I know this routing structure," he said. "From your own accounts?" "From the discrepancy I found 6 weeks ago. The 12,000. He enlarged one of the screenshots with 2 fingers. "The sub pattern is the same. Whoever designed this used the same architecture across all of it." He looked up. "That's unusual. Most sophisticated operations use different architects for different layers compartmentalization. Using the same structure throughout means the person who designed it was confident it would never be connected." "Or arrogant," she said. "Or both." He handed the phone back. "I have something to show you." He turned one of the monitors toward her. She looked at it. It was an org chart, not a formal one. Not something printed and filed somewhere, but a working document, clearly built over time, with nodes connected by lines in different colors that corresponded to a handwritten key in the corner. Names she recognized. Names she didn't. 3 nodes marked with question marks. Her name was on it. Her cover name, Marlowe, in a box, connected by a red line to the central cluster. "You had me mapped," she said. "I had everyone in proximity to my operation mapped." He said it without apology. "Marlowe appeared at the Delancey Club in February, and I started a file that night." "What does the red line mean?" "Unknown affiliation. Could be federal, could be a competitor's asset, could be independent." He paused. "I didn't close the question either way." She studied the chart, found Arthur's node. It was larger than the others. More connections radiating from it, and 2 of those connections extended outside the main cluster to nodes she didn't immediately recognize. She pointed. These two. The left one I've never been able to identify. The right one. He stopped. She looked at him. His expression had done something she hadn't seen it do before. Not the controlled recalibration she'd watched last night when she told him about the 40 million. Something harder. Something that sat in his face like a weight he'd just picked up and hadn't decided yet whether to put down. The right one, he said carefully. I identified 3 days ago. Who is it? He reached past her and typed something. A new window opened a document. Scanned. The kind of paper record that had been photographed rather than digitized originally. She read the header and felt the floor shift slightly under her. It was a federal organizational chart. Internal. Stamped with a classification marking she recognized from her own agency's documentation system. And the name on the node Lucian had circled was not Arthur Pendleton. It was not Thomas Kessler. It was not Thomas Kessler. It was a name she recognized from a completely different context. A name that appeared in a Senate Appropriations Committee report she'd read during her initial briefing on the investigation, listed as an oversight official for federal financial crime task forces. Deputy Director Warren Hale. She was quiet for a long time. Where did you get this? She said. A source inside federal procurement. They pulled it 18 months ago and it's been sitting in a dead drop. I check quarterly. Lucian's voice was even. I didn't know what it meant until 6 weeks ago when I found the account discrepancy. I started connecting it to the shell structure, the routing patterns, the timeline. He paused. Arthur didn't just have your supervisor. He had Kessler's supervisor. The room felt smaller. Deputy Director Warren Hale oversaw 6 active federal investigations into organized financial crime. He had direct authority over the kind of task force Genevieve's operation fed into. He had access to case files, operative identities, source networks. He had access to her real name. He knows who I am, she said. Not a question. If Kessler knows, Hale knows. Yes. She sat down. Not because she chose to. Her legs made the decision, and she followed it. She set her phone on the desk and looked at the screen and looked at the name inside the circle and thought about 8 months of field reports, traveling up a chain that ended at a man with a Senate Appropriations Committee citation and his own node in a criminal organization's architecture. How long, she said. Her voice came out wrong, too quiet, which meant she was closer to the edge of her control than she wanted to be. How long has Hale been connected to Arthur? Based on the routing pattern, the relationship predates the Peloros account by at least a year. I'd estimate 5 to 6 years total. He sat in the chair across from her. The 40 million wasn't Arthur's personal accumulation. It was a shared fund. Arthur skimmed from my operation. Hale provided cover-killed investigations before they got close, redirected federal resources, managed the oversight apparatus. Kessler was the operational layer between them. 3 people, she said. 3 people. Running a $40 million protection scheme for 6 years, using my agency's own investigative apparatus as a monitoring tool. She pressed her fingers to her mouth for a moment, pulled them down, made herself breathe normally, and I walked right into it. 8 months. You weren't supposed to find the shell structure. I found it in month 4, which is why the timeline accelerated, he said. You got too close too fast. They needed Arthur's play tonight to happen, before you documented the infrastructure completely. A change of power inside my organization. Your investigation discredited or buried in the chaos. Kessler managing the evidence chain. He paused. It almost worked. It still might, she said, because right now Hale is the deputy director of a federal law enforcement division, and I'm sitting in your penthouse with no chain of command I can trust. Watching the evidence I've spent 8 months building get liquidated in real time. She stood up. The sitting felt too much like defeat. I need a lawyer, she said. Not yours. Not anyone connected to this organization or to Arthur's network. An independent attorney with federal criminal defense experience who I can establish privilege with immediately. She was thinking out loud now, moving through it the way she moved through field problems systematically, one step producing the next. I need to get my field documentation to a protected channel that Hale can't touch. Somewhere outside the federal system, state attorney's office. A journalist with the right clearances, a congressional oversight contact that doesn't root through Hale's division. I know a journalist. Of course you do. She's legitimate. Investigative financial crime. Published in 3 national outlets. The kind of relationship where I provide background, and she doesn't ask where I got it. He said it without self-consciousness. Covered 3 federal corruption cases in the last 4 years. What's her name? Mara Chen. She's based in D.C. Genevieve filed it. I need time with your financial records. Today, before Arthur's people make another move. I'll have my accounts manager here by 8. Your accounts manager will know who I am by 10 o'clock if Arthur's people are watching your building's foot traffic. Lucian was quiet for a moment. Then we'll use the secondary location. You have a secondary. I have several. He stood, changed. We leave in 40 minutes. She turned toward the door, then stopped. Something had been sitting at the edge of her awareness since he'd shown her the organizational chart, and she turned it over now and looked at it. The source inside federal procurement, she said. The one who pulled the chart 18 months ago. Yes. They pulled a classified internal federal document and put it in your dead drop. Yes. That's not a source. That's an asset. She turned around. You have a federal employee working for you. Lucian held her gaze and said nothing. If I'm going to build anything that survives legal scrutiny, I need to know what I'm working with, she said. Every piece of tainted evidence, every compromised source I need to know, because if it surfaces during prosecution and I don't know about it, it destroys the case. The source is retired, Lucian said, has been for 2 years. They pulled the document before retirement and passed it as a, let's say, personal insurance policy. A pause. It's not tainted in any way, I believe a prosecutor could successfully argue. The document exists. Its contents are accurate. How it arrived with me is a separate question that will be asked, a question that will be managed. He said it with the kind of quiet certainty that she'd been bumping against. Since last night, the particular confidence of a man who had been managing impossible questions for long enough that he'd stopped being troubled by them. 40 minutes, Sinclair. She went. The secondary location was a floor of a commercial building in Midtown that appeared on public records as a data management firm. The elevator required a code she watched Lucian enter rather than being given, and she memorized it automatically, which was either training or habit or both. Space inside was organized differently from the penthouse, more functional, less inhabited, the kind of space that was used rather than lived in. Banks of filing systems, servers, 2 workstations with equipment she recognized as the high end of financial analysis software. His accounts manager was a woman named Petra, 60s, with the particular manner of someone who'd spent decades in close proximity to money and had arrived at a kind of serene indifference to it. She shook Genevieve's hand without asking who she was, which meant Lucian had called ahead in the 40 minutes he'd said it would take to leave. I need the disbursement records from the last 4 years, Genevieve said. Specifically, anything that touches the accounts in the Helios structure. She'd identified the internal name from a document she'd seen briefly on Lucian's monitor. And I need the sub-account mapping for any transactions that were fractured and reassembled split disbursements under 10,000, cycled through more than 2 relay points. Petra looked at Lucian. He nodded once. Petra sat down and started pulling files. The next 3 hours were the most focused Genevieve had been in months, the kind of focus that happened when everything peripheral fell away and left only the problem. She moved between the printed records Petra provided and her own documentation, building a cross-reference matrix that she could feel taking shape the way cases always took shape when you had enough information in the right arrangement. The external evidence she'd built over 8 months' account. Records obtained through legitimate investigative channels, now mapped against Lucian's internal documentation in a way that produced something neither alone could achieve. Corroboration. The 40 million wasn't an allegation anymore. It was a documented, cross-referenced, time-stamped financial record supported by both external investigative evidence and internal organizational documentation. Arthur Pendleton's name wasn't just adjacent to the money, it was embedded in the transaction structure in 17 distinct places over 4 years. Kessler's name appeared twice, indirectly, but traceable, a communications record Petra located in a section of archived files that had been flagged for review and never reviewed, Kind of bureaucratic delay that happened in large organizations and usually meant nothing and occasionally meant everything. Hale's name didn't appear directly. It wouldn't a man in his position would have maintained sufficient distance for plausible deniability. But the routing pattern of the shell accounts aligned with a pattern she'd documented from federal oversight reports that crossed Hale's desk. It wasn't a signature, but it was a fingerprint. She was building the third layer of corroboration when her phone rang. Unknown number. The kind of unknown that meant someone was using a routed call to mask the origin point. She answered Genevieve. The voice was warm, familiar. The particular warmth of someone who'd spent years using warmth as a professional tool. Deputy Director Warren Hale. She didn't speak. I know you're trying to decide whether to hang up, Hale said. I'd encourage you not to. We need to have a conversation that's past due. She looked at Lucian across the room. He read something in her face and moved toward her without hurrying. How did you get this number? She said. Genevieve. A gentle patience in his voice, like a man correcting a student who'd asked the wrong question. I've had this number for 6 months. I've had your real number since month 2 of your operation. A pause. We've been very patient with your investigation. Patient, she said. Patient. Because the work you were doing was genuinely useful to us. You were mapping the shell structure from the outside in a way our internal resources couldn't do without tipping off the architects. Your field documentation is exceptional, genuinely. The warmth again, and now she could hear it for what it was, the specific quality of condescension that dressed itself as praise. But last night changed the operational parameters considerably. Arthur's play, she said. Arthur's play was premature and unauthorized. He was supposed to wait another 3 weeks. The impatience of the man. A brief, controlled exhale. The point is, we have a situation now that requires resolution, and I'm calling you because I believe you're a reasonable person who understands how these things work. She was watching Lucian watch her. His face was very still. What do you want? She said. I want the documentation you've built. All of it, the shell account mapping, the transaction records, the cross-reference you've presumably been building overnight. In exchange, I can offer you something genuinely valuable. A pause for effect. Your career, your name. The ability to go back to your life without any of what happened last night attached to it. Another pause. You're 34 years old. 8 years of distinguished field service. This doesn't have to end your career, Genevieve. It doesn't have to end anything. She looked at the desk in front of her. 3 hours of work. 17 documented instances of Arthur's name in the transaction records. Kessler's fingerprints in the communications archive. The fingerprint she'd built toward Hale, not a signature but enough. And Vescari, she said. What happens to him? A brief silence that told her the question had landed somewhere he hadn't fully prepared for. Vescari is a separate conversation. You want me to deliver the evidence and walk away. And Vescari's organization becomes Symes. Vescari's organization is not your concern, Hale said, and the warmth had dropped by about 10 degrees. Your concern is your future. Your concern is whether you walk away from last night with your career and your freedom intact, or whether you spend the next 3 years in federal proceedings answering questions about why an undercover operative spent the night in a criminal principal's residence and spent 6 hours cross-referencing his internal financial records. There it was. She made herself breathe once, slowly. 48 hours, she said. I'm sorry? Give me 48 hours. A silence. She could hear him, assessing it, trying to determine whether she was stalling, negotiating, or cracking. Genevieve, 48 hours, and I'll call you back. She kept her voice level, even. The voice of someone who hadn't decided yet, which was the only voice that would buy her anything. I need time to think about what you're offering. Another silence, longer. 48 hours, Hale said, after which the situation becomes considerably less manageable for everyone. He ended the call. She set the phone on the desk and looked at it and felt the specific cold of understanding exactly how far into something she was. Hale, Lucian said. Yes. He called your personal number. He's had it for 6 months. She said it flatly. He said my documentation has been useful to them. They've been watching me map the shell structure from the outside. She looked up. I wasn't investigating Arthur. I was doing their due diligence for them, making sure no one else was getting close before they could execute their own exit from the arrangement. Lucian was very still. He wants the documentation. All of it. In exchange, my career survives, and we pretend last night didn't happen. She picked up the phone, put it down, and if I don't deliver in 48 hours, he buries me in procedural violations that will keep me out of any courtroom for 3 years. He'll bury you regardless, Lucian said. I know that. The moment you hand him the documentation, I know. She cut him off because she couldn't hear the end of that sentence said out loud right now. She already knew it. She'd known it from the first 5 seconds of Hale's voice on the line. He made a mistake. Lucian waited. He told me he's had my number for 6 months. He told me they've been watching my investigation develop. She turned to face him fully. That means there's a record of that monitoring. Somewhere in the federal system, there are logs of access to my field reports. Metadata. Someone accessed my operational file repeatedly over 8 months, and it wasn't just Kessler, it was Hale, using his director-level clearance. And that kind of access gets logged automatically. She was building it as she spoke, the way she built everything, one verified piece producing the next. I can't pull those logs from inside the system, but someone with the right access could. Lucian looked at her for a moment. My procurement source. Your retired procurement source who spent 30 years inside the federal record system and presumably knows where access logs are archived. She held his gaze. Can they still reach those records? I can ask. Ask now. She turned back to the desk. Because if those logs exist and I can document that Hale accessed my investigation from the inside, that's not a fingerprint. It's a signature. She looked at the stacked records in front of her. And I have 47 hours and 50 minutes to build something he can't bury. Petra had been working steadily through all of it, the phone call, the conversation with the composure of a woman who'd learned long ago that what she didn't hear couldn't be attributed to her. She sat in a stack of documents on the desk beside Genevieve without being asked. These are the archived sub-account records from year 1, she said. I thought you might want to start at the beginning. Genevieve looked at her. Petra looked back. No expression she could identify as sympathy or its opposite. Just the steady attention of someone doing their job with precision. Thank you, Genevieve said. She pulled the top document from the stack, and behind her, Lucian was already on the phone, speaking quietly in the corner of the room, calling in a debt from a retired federal employee who probably hadn't expected to be called, and certainly hadn't expected this. Asking for access logs from a system that was supposed to be sealed. 48 hours had already started, and somewhere in the federal building, 3 miles south of where she was sitting, Warren Hale was looking at his own clock and making his own calculations. And the thing she understood, the thing that had settled into her chest with the particular weight of a fact she couldn't unknow, was that he wasn't planning to give her 48 hours. He'd said 48 to buy himself time to move. And whatever he was planning to do next had probably already begun, and the woman who'd walked into a Manhattan ballroom 20 hours ago as a federal investigator was now building a case against her own chain of command from inside a criminal organization's secondary office, with a retired government employee as her best source and a crime boss as her only ally, and there was no version of what came next that looked anything like the career she'd had before. The only question was whether she could build something solid enough, fast enough, to matter, before Hale decided that 48 hours was 47 too many. Her pen moved across the first page of the Year 1 records. She had work to do. The access logs came through at 11:47 a.m. Lucian's source, a man named Draper, retired, 68 years old, living in Bethesda, with apparently nothing left to lose, had pulled them from a federal archive that still recognized his old clearance credentials, which told Genevieve something about how thoroughly federal systems actually got scrubbed when people left. The answer was not thoroughly enough. She spread the printed pages across the desk and read them twice before she let herself believe what she was seeing. Hale had accessed her operational file 31 times over 8 months. Not Kessler Hale directly, using his own director-level credentials, which meant the access was logged under his name and his alone. Every field report she'd submitted, every financial document she'd uploaded to the secure case management system, every update to her source contacts, her surveillance logs, her account mapping, 31 times. The man had been reading her investigation like a subscription. He's going to say it was oversight. she said. Director-level review of active field operations. He has standing to access case files. Does he have standing to access them 31 times over 8 months for a single operative's case? Lucian asked. No standard oversight protocol justifies that frequency. She set the pages down. But his attorneys will argue it anyway, and without someone who can testify to the internal protocol standards, it's a procedural argument that takes months to resolve. Then we need someone who can testify to the standards. I need an IG contact. Inspector General's office, independent of Hale's divisional authority. She was already moving through the contact structure in her head. 8 years, in the agency, relationships built across divisions. The specific people she'd trusted, for reasons that had nothing to do with the chain of command that had just collapsed. There's a woman named Rourke. Patricia Rourke. She runs an independent oversight unit that reports directly to Congress rather than through the director's office. We were at Quantico together 12 years ago. Do you trust her? She thought about Kessler, thought about how long she'd trusted him. I trust her more than anyone else I currently have access to, she said, which was the most honest version of the answer. That's not the same thing. No, it's not. She picked up her phone. But it's what I have. She stepped away from the desk and dialed from memory. Rourke picked up on the third ring, the sound of her voice brisk, familiar. Carrying the faint background noise of a federal building hallway was the first thing in the past 20 hours that felt like solid ground under Genevieve's feet. Sinclair. No surprise. Which meant Rourke had already heard something, or been watching something, or both. I've been wondering when you were going to call. How much do you know? Enough to know you shouldn't be calling me on this line. Give me 4 minutes. The line went quiet. Genevieve counted. At 3 minutes 50 seconds, Rourke came back on from what sounded like an exterior space wind against the microphone. Footsteps on concrete. Okay. Talk Hale, Genevieve said. A pause. Short but significant. That's a significant name to say out loud. I have access logs showing 31 instances of director-level access to my operational file over the past 8 months. I have cross-referenced financial documentation linking a shell account network to a senior organizational figure inside the syndicate I was investigating and to 2 members of my own chain of command. I have internal account records obtained through. She stopped, chose her words, obtained through cooperation with a principal who has reason to want this documented as much as I do. How clean is the cooperation? Clean enough that a good prosecutor can work with it. Not clean enough that a bad one can't attack it. She was honest about that, because Rourke would find out anyway, and finding out later was worse. I need an independent evidence channel. Something that doesn't route through Hale's divisional authority. I need it in the next, she checked the time, 35 hours. Because Hale gave you 48. She went still. How do you know about that? Because 30 minutes after he called you, he called a colleague of mine to ask whether my unit had any active interest in a case involving a field operative named Sinclair. Rourke's voice was dry, which is how I knew you were going to call. The specific cold of understanding arrived again, the same cold she'd felt at 4:47 in the morning when the liquidation alert had lit up her screen. Hale wasn't waiting 48 hours. He'd started moving the moment he ended the call with her. The 48 was a frame. Something to point to later. I gave her the opportunity. She chose not to cooperate. He's already building the procedural case against me, Genevieve said. He's building it fast. Rourke paused. Sinclair, I need you to understand what I'm stepping into if I take this. Hale has been in his position for 9 years. He has relationships across every relevant congressional oversight committee. If I move on this and the documentation doesn't hold, it holds. She said it with a certainty she'd earned across 3 hours of cross-referencing. I have 17 documented transaction instances connecting the principal to the shell accounts. I have access logs under Hale's own credentials. I have a communications record connecting my supervisor directly to the shell network. And I have the originating document placing Hale in the organizational structure of the syndicate's financial operation. She breathed. It holds a long silence. Get it to me, Rourke said. Encrypted, through the independent channel. You know the drop. She did. A secure documentation system the IG unit maintained independently of the main agency infrastructure. She'd used it once, 3 years ago, for something she'd hoped she'd never have to escalate. How long after I drop it before you can move? If what you're describing is what you're describing, 6 hours, maybe less. Another pause. Where are you going to be? Genevieve looked across the room at Lucien, who was watching her with the focused stillness of a man reading a situation through someone else's half of a phone conversation. I don't know yet, she said. She ended the call and turned back to the desk. We have a window, she said. But Hale's already moving. He called Rourke's office 30 minutes after he called me. Lucian's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. Then he knows about Rourke. He was checking whether she had independent interest in my case, which means he's trying to close off my external channels before I can use them. She moved back to the desk, started organizing the documentation into the transmission package access logs, cross-referenced financial records, Kessler's communications archive, the organizational chart. We need to transmit in the next hour, before he can get any kind of procedural block in place. There's a problem, Lucien said. She looked up. Arthur called 20 minutes ago. He said it the way he said everything evenly, without editorializing, like he was reporting weather. He's called a council meeting. Tonight, 8 o'clock, at the Remington Club. She set down what she was holding. Tonight, he's moving faster than I expected. The gala didn't go the way he planned. I'm still standing, you're still visible, and the police presence creates a window he needs to close before any of the council members start asking questions he can't control. Lucien's voice was measured. He's going to present his case to the council tonight. Remove me through organizational process before he has to do it any other way. And if you don't appear, absence is read as concession. Council has authority to act without me print. He paused. I have to be there. With me. With you. The fiancé, who was present at the gala and is now apparently comfortable enough to appear at a council meeting that's a narrative that counters Arthur's version of events. He looked at her directly. It's also a problem. Because appearing means you're visible to every member of Arthur's network simultaneously. And if Hale is coordinating with Arthur, which he is, then walking into that meeting puts you in a room with people who have every reason to want you gone, and a deputy director of a federal law enforcement division providing them cover. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not going to tell you what to choose. She heard that. Specific weight of it, the thing he wasn't saying, which was that every option she had left was some version of terrible, and he was going to let her pick her own terrible rather than pick it for her. She looked at the documentation package on the desk, looked at the time, looked at the window south-facing, Midtown Manhattan, spreading out below them in the flat November light, the city doing its relentless thing. Transmit the documentation first, she said. Everything goes to Rourke's drop in the next 45 minutes. Then we go to the meeting. You understand what that means. It means if something goes wrong at the meeting, the documentation is already in independent hands, and Hale can't suppress it. She started moving. It also means if something goes wrong, I'm the only copy of the contextual knowledge that connects everything on paper to everything that actually happened. Which makes me essential, Lucien said, or a liability, depending on who's doing the calculation. She worked for 40 minutes straight, organized, encrypted, transmitted. The package hit Rourke's secure drop at 1:23 p.m. and she received an automated confirmation receipt that told her it had arrived intact. She photographed the confirmation, sent a copy to an encrypted personal archive. She maintained on a server in another state under a name that wasn't hers and wasn't Marlowe. Then she changed into the clothes that had been arranged for her, dark, fitted, appropriate for an evening meeting without being formal enough to read as performance, and she thought about what she was walking into. The Remington Club was private, members only, the kind of institution that didn't appear in any directory and operated through a reservation system that required existing membership to access. She'd identified it as a syndicate council meeting location. 7 weeks ago, from a communication intercept she'd documented and submitted to Kessler, which meant Kessler had passed the location to Arthur, which meant Arthur had chosen it tonight, knowing she knew it. He was inviting her to walk into a place where he held every structural advantage. The car ride took 22 minutes. Lucien sat beside her and didn't attempt conversation, which she was grateful, for she was running her own internal preparation, and she needed the silence. Her hands were still. She'd worked herself past the shaking stage sometime around the 3rd hour with the financial records, and what was left was the particular flatness of someone who'd run out of adrenaline and was running on something older and less dramatic. Purpose, maybe, or stubbornness. She'd never been entirely sure which one she was actually made of. The Remington Club's entrance was an unmarked door on a side street that a person could walk past 100 times without registering. Lucian's man opened it. They went through. Inside, dark wood, low light, the specific hush of a space that had been insulated against the outside world by a century of careful maintenance. A man at the interior entrance nodded at Lucian without making eye contact with Genevieve, which meant he'd been told she existed but hadn't been told to treat her as anything in particular. She registered the room as they moved through it, 4 people visible. 2 more. She could track by sound through a door to the left, a staircase ahead. The council meeting was on the 2nd floor. She heard Arthur before she saw him. His voice, carrying through the closed door at the top of the stairs, measured, deliberate, a specific cadence of a man in the middle of a prepared presentation. She caught fragments, stability of the organization, and leadership that reflects the current reality, and decisions made without consultation. Lucian put his hand on the door handle, looked at her once. She nodded. He opened it. The room held 8 people, 6, seated at a long table. Arthur standing at the far end, one man near the wall, who was either security or something she hadn't categorized yet. The 8 faces turned toward the door in a single movement, the way faces do when a room is disrupted, and she saw the sequence of reactions move through them. Recognition of Lucian, recalibration of the situation, and then Arthur, a flash of something behind his eyes that was there and gone in less than a second. He hadn't expected her. He'd expected Lucian to appear alone, or not at all, and he'd prepared for both. He hadn't prepared for her. Good. Lucian. Arthur's voice reset itself to measured concern inside a single syllable. The man was fast. She gave him that. I wasn't certain you'd come. Down, Arthur, Lucian said. A beat. Arthur stood. Council has gathered to discuss. Sit down. The room held its breath. Arthur sat. Not because he'd decided to. She could read that clearly, but because the calculation of whether to keep standing had come out against him, and he was a man who followed his calculations. Lucian moved to the head of the table. Genevieve moved with him, 1 step back and left, which put her with sightlines to every face in the room and her back to nothing. You called this meeting to present a case for my removal, Lucian said. His voice was entirely without drama, the most dangerous kind of calm. I'm going to let you present it, and then I'm going to present mine. Arthur looked at Genevieve, the specific quality of that look, the inventory, the reassessment, the micro-decision being made behind his eyes, made the hair on her arms move. The matter of your companion is relevant to the discussion, Arthur said. Council should know who they're. Her name is Genevieve Sinclair. Lucian said it cleanly. No hesitation, no performance. She's a federal investigator who has spent 8 months documenting your theft of $40 million from this organization's accounts. The room changed. Not loudly. The people around the table didn't shout or stand, but something shifted in the quality of the silence from formal to electric. The specific charge of a room full of people who have just been handed information that rearranges everything they thought they were here for. Arthur stood. The measured calm dropped, and underneath it was something she'd been waiting to see, the actual version of the man, without the patrician performance. His face had gone pale and tight, and his hands were flat on the table. You're bringing a federal agent into a council meeting. I'm bringing the person who can prove what you've done, Lucian said. There's a difference. She's going to burn every person in this room. She's going to burn you, Lucian said. Specifically, the documentation has already been transmitted to an independent federal oversight office and is currently outside the control of the officials you've been paying to keep it buried. He paused. $40 million. 4 years. 17 documented instances of direct transaction fingerprint across the Shell account network. Paloros Consulting Group, Helios sub-accounts, and 2 new accounts created at 4:47 this morning in what I believe was your first move toward exiting this arrangement before anyone noticed. Arthur's eyes moved to Genevieve. They had a quality she recognized, the specific focus of a man deciding whether the problem across the table could still be solved the fast way. She held his gaze and did not look away. Her pulse was elevated. feel it in her throat, in the tips of her fingers. Kept her hands still. You have nothing, Arthur said. Whatever she's built is compromised. She's been operating inside your residence. She's shared federal evidence with a criminal organization's principal. Any competent defense attorney shreds her credibility in 40 minutes. The access logs are under Warren Hale's credentials, Genevieve said. Her voice came out level. She was proud of that. 31 access instances to my operational file over 8 months. That's Hale's name, Hale's clearance code, Hale's own federal record. Competent defense attorney shredding my credibility doesn't touch a director's access logs pulled from a federal archive. The name landed the way she'd known it would. She watched it move through the room. She watched the seated council members exchange. It's a look that told her they recognized the name and understood what it meant to have it attached to this, and watched Arthur absorb the information and begin visibly to restructure. Hale will deny. Hale is already moving to build a procedural case against me, she said, which is why the documentation was transmitted 90 minutes ago, before he could establish any blocking mechanism. She took a breath. He has hours, not days, before the IG unit processes what I've sent. After that, it's a congressional oversight matter, and congressional oversight doesn't run through his office. Arthur looked at Lucien. Something passed between them, years of proximity, of working in the same structure, of the kind of professional familiarity that made betrayal possible, because trust had to exist first for betrayal to mean anything. You're destroying everything, Arthur said. And for the first time, underneath the calculation and the performance and the controlled delivery, she heard something that might have been genuine. 16 years. You started destroying it 4 years ago, Lucien said. You just did it quietly. For 3 seconds, nobody in the room moved. Then Arthur's hand went under his jacket. She moved before she fully processed it, stepped left, toward the table rather than away from it, which was the wrong direction by conventional logic, but put her out of the direct line between Arthur's position and Lucien. She was reaching for the secondary device she'd carried. Since this morning, a small tactical deterrent she'd taken from a case in the secondary office's equipment storage, and that she was technically carrying without authorization, when Lucien moved faster than she'd expected him to, crossed the space between them in 2 steps, got his hand to Arthur's wrist before the weapon cleared the jacket, and the sound that followed was the specific sound of a joint being stressed past its comfortable limit, Arthur's sharp exhale. Involuntary, the sound pain makes before a person has time to decide whether to perform it. The weapon dropped. The man near the wall had his own weapon out now. She had her deterrent up and pointed in his direction, and they were looking at each other across a room full of council members who had pressed themselves back from the table in a collective motion she'd registered in her peripheral vision. Tell him to stand down, she said to Arthur. Arthur was bent at the waist, his wrist in Lucien's grip, his face a color she'd describe as gray. He said nothing, Arthur. Lucien's voice was very quiet now, specific quiet that was worse than volume. Tell him. A sound from Arthur that was the compressed version of a word. His man lowered the weapon by about 6 inches, not down, not holstered, but down enough that the immediate math of the room changed. Kept hers up. The meeting is over, Lucien said to the council. He didn't look at them, kept his eyes on Arthur, his grip on Arthur's wrist. You've heard what you needed to hear. The financial documentation exists. It's outside this organization's control, and the decision about what you do with that information is yours to make. Council members moved toward the door, not rushing, not quite the specific dignity of people who were very frightened and were managing it with the tools their particular lives had given them, which were mostly the tools of composure. When the door closed behind the last of them, the room held 3 people and 1 man near the wall with a weapon at half-mast. Arthur straightened. Lucien released his wrist. Arthur looked at her. His face had reassembled itself into something not the patrician warmth. Not the measured calm, but something stripped of both. The version underneath. Hale isn't going to stop, he said. Whatever you've sent to your IG contact. However clean you think the documentation is, he has resources you cannot match. Maybe, she said, he will burn you down specifically. Your career, your name, your ability to practice law or work in any federal adjacent capacity for the rest of your professional life. He said it without heat, just statement. He's done it before. I know, she said. and you're doing it anyway. She looked at him. At the man who'd stood in a ballroom with masked gunmen taking aim at people and calmly relayed positions through an earpiece. Yes, she said. Arthur looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Lucian. Something moved across his face that she couldn't name and didn't try to. He walked toward the door. Arthur, Lucian said. He stopped but didn't turn. The council is going to make a decision, Lucian said. You should be somewhere that decision doesn't reach you. Arthur stood in the doorway for 3 seconds. Then he walked out. The man near the wall looked at Lucian, looked at Genevieve, and followed. She stood in the sudden quiet of the room, and her hands were shaking again. The real kind, the kind that happened after, rather than during, when the nervous system sent its invoice for everything the last hour had cost. She let them shake. She was past caring about what he saw. Lucian picked up the weapon from the floor, set it on the table with a deliberateness that looked like something other than practicality. He'll run, she said. Yes. We need her phone lit up. Rourke's number, she answered. Tell me. I need you to listen carefully. Rourke's voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before, not panic. Rourke didn't panic, but something compressed and fast. The documentation you sent. I've had 2 senior attorneys review it in the last hour. Solid. It's genuinely solid. The access logs alone are significant. A breath. Hale filed an emergency administrative review of your operative status 40 minutes ago. He's claiming you've been compromised by extended contact with a criminal principal and that the evidence you've transmitted is tainted by that contact. He's discrediting the source before the oversight committee can evaluate the substance. Yes, and he has a relationship with 2 committee members that gives him enough procedural standing to delay. Rourke paused. Sinclair, I can fight this. I believe I can fight this. But I need something he can't discredit procedurally. Something that doesn't come from you, doesn't come from Vescari, and doesn't route through any channel Hale has touched. Genevieve looked at Lucian. He looked back. She thought about the organizational chart, the name in the circle, the 6-year arrangement. She thought about Arthur and where Arthur was going right now and what Arthur knew. I need Arthur Pendleton, she said. Rourke was quiet for a moment. He's a criminal. He's a criminal who can place Hale at the center of the financial scheme from the inside, because he's the one who brought Hale into it. She was working it out as she said it. He has personal knowledge of the arrangement, communications, meetings, the initiation of the deal. That's not tainted evidence routed through a compromised operative. That's a direct eyewitness account from a participant. She paused. It's also the only account that puts Hale's involvement in a form that can't be challenged on procedural grounds. Can you get to him? She looked at Lucian. Can you get to Arthur? She said. Lucian looked at the door. Arthur had walked through 60 seconds ago, and she could see him calculating distance, time, resources, the specific question of whether a man running had started running yet or was still in the building. Give me 3 minutes, he said. He walked to the door. She stood in the room alone, with Rourke on the line in the city outside, and the weapon on the table, and 35 hours left on a clock. Hale was actively trying to run out. She understood with a clarity that required no analysis that the next 3 minutes would determine whether the thing she'd spent 8 months building would survive the people who'd been managing it. Rourke, she said, still here. Whatever happens in the next hour, the documentation I sent you is accurate. All of it. She kept her voice steady. I need you to know that independent of what happens to me. A pause. I know, Rourke said. The door at the far end of the room opened. Lucian came back, and behind him, walking with the controlled movement of a man who'd made a calculation and didn't like the answer, but was following it anyway, was Arthur Pendleton. His eyes found hers across the room. She looked back at him and held the phone toward him. There's someone who needs to hear what you know about Warren Hale, she said, and you're going to tell her. Arthur Pendleton took the phone. He held it the way a man holds something he knows will cost him carefully, with the specific awareness of weight that isn't physical. He looked at it for a moment, and Genevieve watched his face and saw the thing she hadn't expected to see in it. Not calculation, not the reassembled patrician composure, not the cold functionality of a man running his options. Just a man who was tired, deeply, structurally tired. The kind that had been accumulating for years and had finally reached the surface because there was nothing left worth maintaining the performance for. put the phone to his ear. "This is Arthur Pendleton," he said. His voice was even. "I understand you need a statement." Genevieve stepped back, gave him the room. She moved to the window and looked out at the Manhattan evening, the city assembling itself into its nighttime version. Lights coming on in the buildings across the street, particular blue of the sky at that hour, when it wasn't quite dark and wasn't quite anything else. Her reflection was faint in the glass. She looked at it and didn't recognize herself immediately, which was a strange sensation. She filed and moved past. Behind her, Arthur talked. She didn't listen to the words. She didn't need to. Whatever he was telling Rourke was between him and the weight he'd decided to put down. She'd hear the official version later, in a format with timestamps and legal signatures. Right now, she needed 30 seconds of not managing anything, and the window gave her that, and she took it without apology. Lucian was standing near the door. She could see his reflection in the glass, the stillness of him, the quality of attention he brought to a room that never felt like surveillance, but always meant he was tracking everything. She'd gotten used to it faster than she should have. She noted that too, and filed it with everything else she'd been filing for later examination. Arthur spoke for 11 minutes. When he finished, he held the phone out toward her, without turning around, and she crossed the room and took it. "Sinclair." Rourke's voice was different now. The compression was still there, but underneath it, something had shifted, the specific quality of someone who has just been handed more than they expected and is recalibrating the weight. He gave me the initiation meeting. Date, location, who was present. He gave me the communication structure between himself and Hale, and 3 specific instances of Hale directing federal investigative resources away from the shell account network. A pause. He also gave me something I didn't expect. "What?" "Kessler didn't come to Hale. Hale recruited Kessler." Rourke's voice was careful. 4 years ago, Hale identified Kessler as someone with financial pressure debt, a family situation, the kind of vulnerability that makes a person a candidate. He approached him through an intermediary, brought him into the arrangement gradually. Kessler thought he was working for Arthur. He didn't know until 18 months ago that Arthur was working for Hale. Genevieve was quiet for a moment. "Kessler thought he was the top of the chain," she said. "Thought Arthur was. He didn't know about Hale until the arrangement was too established to exit." Rourke paused. "I'm not telling you this to generate sympathy for Kessler. I'm telling you because it changes the prosecution architecture. Hale was running both of them, Arthur from the outside, Kessler from the inside. Your entire investigation was designed and managed by the man it was supposed to be investigating." She sat down. The chair was there and she used it. 8 months. Not just monitored. Designed. Hale had looked at the financial crime landscape and built an investigation as a monitoring tool, used the federal apparatus as his own private early warning system. Anytime independent evidence got close to the shell network, it would surface through the investigation, route up through Kessler, reach Hale, and get redirected. Clean, elegant. The kind of scheme that required someone who understood both sides of the architecture from the inside. "Can you move on it?" she said. "I've been on the phone with the Senate Oversight Chair's office for the last 20 minutes. With Arthur's statement corroborating the access logs and the financial documentation." Rourke stopped, started again. "Yes, we can move. I'm filing for emergency investigative authority tonight, which will freeze Hale's administrative review of your operative status and put his division under independent oversight pending investigation." A breath. "It won't be clean, Sinclair. It's going to be long, and it's going to be contested. And Hale has resources and relationships that will make every step of this a fight. But it moves. It moves." She breathed. "Okay, I need you to come in. Not to Kessler's office. Not anywhere near Hale's divisional authority, directly to my unit. Tonight, if you can manage it." She looked at Lucian. He'd been watching her throughout the call, and she understood, from the quality of his attention, that he'd read most of the conversation from her face, the shift when Rourke told her about Kessler, the moment she'd sat down, the breath that came after. "Tonight," she told Rourke, "give me 2 hours." She ended the call. The room was very quiet. Arthur was standing near the far wall, and she looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time without the filter of what he'd done at the gala, or what he represented in the financial records, or what he'd reached for when the council meeting collapsed. Just a man in a room who'd spent 16 years building something that had turned out to be someone else's architecture all along. Hale recruited you, she said. Arthur looked at her. Corporate intermediary, a consulting firm. Took me 8 months to understand what I was actually inside. He paused. By then the money existed. The relationship existed. The exit cost was higher than staying. Something moved through his face. Told myself it was the organization's money anyway. Rationalizations are easier than you think when you're standing inside one. She didn't respond to that. She wasn't in the business of absolving anyone tonight, including people who'd helped her. What Rourke does with your statement is her business, Genevieve said. I can't promise you anything about the legal outcome. I know. He didn't seem to expect a promise. He looked like a man who'd stopped expecting things he hadn't earned. He walked out without another word. She watched him go and wondered, distantly, whether she'd ever know what actually happened to him, whether the statement was enough to buy him a deal, whether a prosecutors would look at 16 years inside a criminal organization and decide the cooperation wasn't sufficient. Probably wouldn't know. Cases went in directions. You stopped being able to follow once you were no longer the one building them. She looked at Lucien. He was still near the door, and he was looking back at her, and the thing she'd seen at 5 a.m. In his study, the tiredness, the real kind, the accumulated kind was visible again now, in the way his shoulders held, and the set of his mouth, and the specific quality of his eyes at this particular end of this particular day. I have to go to Rourke, she said. I know. Tonight. Yes. He pushed off the wall and moved toward her, and she held still, because she wasn't sure what the movement meant, and she'd learned in the last 36 hours not to assume she understood his grammar as well as she'd started to think she did. He stopped 3 feet from her. The documentation you transmitted, I'm in it, peripherally. The cross-referencing establishes that the shell accounts were connected to your organizational structure, but the transaction evidence points at Arthur specifically. She kept her voice careful, honest. A thorough prosecution will look at your organization's financial practices broadly. Can't tell you that nothing in what I've built creates exposure for you. I know that. Then you know that whatever Rourke's investigation produces may include my operation. Yes. He said it without apparent distress, which was either genuine equanimity or the performance of it, and she'd stopped being certain she could tell the difference. I made the choice to give you access to the records. I made the choice tonight. He paused. I made all of them. She looked at him for a moment. Why? He looked back. You know why. I want to hear you say it. A silence that lasted long enough to mean something. Because Arthur was stealing from me, and I couldn't prove it without you, he said. Because Hale had a reach inside my operation that I couldn't map without the federal access logs you pulled. Because he stopped. Started again with the particular precision of a man choosing his words because the wrong ones would be worse than fewer. Because you walked into a room last night that you should have run from, and you stayed because the work mattered more than your safety, and that's a thing I understand. She looked at him for a long moment. That's not the whole answer. No, he agreed, it's not. She picked up her phone, coat, the things she'd come with, which were fewer than she'd started the night with, in some ways and more in others. The investigation into your organization, she said. It's going to happen regardless of what I do. Rourke's unit, once it has authority, will look at everything adjacent to Hale's involvement. I know. You should talk to an attorney, not the one who showed up at the gala, someone outside that structure. I'll handle it. I'm not trying to... She stopped. She wasn't sure what she was trying to do. Warn him. Protect him. Something that sat at the uncomfortable intersection of professional obligation and the thing that had developed in the past 36 hours that she didn't have a name for yet and wasn't going to name right now in a private club with a weapon on, table and Rourke waiting for her 2 miles south. I'm trying to be honest about what comes next. I know what comes next, he said. Go. She went. The next 6 hours were the most procedurally intense of her career, which was a high bar. Rourke's unit was in a federal building in Lower Manhattan that required 3 levels of authorization to enter, and the room they put her in had the specific sterility of a space that existed entirely for the purpose of extracting and documenting information from people who'd been in places they shouldn't have been and seen things that needed to be officially recorded. She gave her statement for 4 hours. Every detail, in order, without omission. The gala, the service door, Arthur's earpiece, Lucian's offer in the corridor, penthouse, the financial records, the discovery of Peloros, Hale's phone call, the 48-hour frame, the council meeting, Arthur's statement and what she'd understood about Kessler's position in the arrangement from what Rourke had told her. She was precise and complete, and she did not editorialize, and she did not ask for anything in exchange. When she finished, Rourke sat across from her with 3 other attorneys and a federal investigator she didn't recognize, and the room was quiet for a moment, in the way rooms go quiet when a lot of information has just landed and needs a moment to settle. Your operative status, Rourke said. Hale's administrative review is frozen, pending our investigation. That protects you procedurally for now. She paused. Question of what happens to your position long-term is going to depend on how this develops. I know. There will be people who look at the choices you made in the last 36 hours and see violation of protocol. Sharing federal evidence with a criminal principal, operating without authorization outside your case parameters, using equipment without sanction. I know. And there will be people who look at what those choices produced and see effective field work under impossible conditions. Rourke held her gaze steadily. I'm going to be one of the second kind. That matters. It may not be enough. It might not be, Genevieve agreed. Get some sleep. Come back in the morning. This is going to take time. She walked out of the building at 2:14 a.m. into a Manhattan that had gone into its quiet hours silent. Never silent, but the particular low-register version of itself that existed between 2 and 5 a.m. When the city was still running but running at reduced speed. She stood on the sidewalk. She had nowhere specific to be, which was a sensation she hadn't experienced in 8 months. Cover Identity had an apartment, a real apartment she'd actually lived in, with Aziz and a neighbor who'd twice borrowed coffee and once stopped her in the hallway to talk about a problem with the building's heating. She could go there. It was technically still hers. She stood on the sidewalk for 3 minutes and did nothing. Then she took out her phone and sent a text to a number she'd memorized. It's done, I'm out. The response came in 40 seconds. Are you all right? She looked at the question for a moment. At the specific way it had been asked. Not are you safe? Not what happened. Not any of the procedural questions. Just that one. She typed, I don't know yet. His response, that's honest. Put the phone in her pocket and walked. She didn't go to the cover apartment. She walked 17 blocks north through the 2A.M. city and checked into a hotel under her real name, using her real identification, which was the first time in 8 months she'd done that, and the desk clerk handed her a key card without looking at her, and she went to the room and sat on the edge of the bed and took off her shoes. Both of them. She slept for 9 hours without dreaming, which was the deepest sleep she'd had in longer than she could calculate. Following weeks were nothing like resolution. They were paperwork and testimony, and the specific grind of a federal investigation turned inward on itself, the strange, uncomfortable process of an institution examining its own infection. Rourke's unit moved fast by institutional standards, which meant slowly by any other measure. Hale's attorneys filed 17 procedural challenges in the first 10 days. 2 were successful, which delayed specific evidence processing by nearly a month. Hale himself remained in his position for the first 3 weeks, which was the most surreal part, the fact that a man she'd documented at the center of a 6-year federal protection scheme continued to occupy his office and sign his name to division-wide memos, whilst investigators built the case against him, floor by floor. He resigned on a Tuesday morning, the kind of quiet resignation that was announced in a 3-line internal memo and generated a single paragraph in 2 national outlets. The formal charges came 4 days later, by which point he'd retained 4 attorneys and issued a statement that described the allegations as politically motivated and the evidence as fabricated or miscontextualized. The evidence was neither. Kessler was arrested on a Wednesday. She heard about it from Rourke in a phone call that lasted 4 minutes and had the particular flat quality of a call delivering information that was supposed to produce satisfaction and produced. Instead, something more complicated and less comfortable. She'd spent 8 months trusting a man whose name was now on a federal charging document, and the thing she felt about that wasn't triumph. It was closer to grief, and she didn't examine it too carefully because examination wasn't going to change the shape of it. Arthur's cooperation agreement was finalized 6 weeks after the council meeting. She didn't see the terms. She heard, through Rourke, that it was not lenient cooperation, reduced the exposure, but didn't eliminate it. And the years he'd spent inside the organizational structure created a complicated legal picture that would take longer than she'd like to be following the case to fully resolve. Her own status was confirmed in week 4. Rourke delivered it in person. Which she'd understood when she saw Rourke walk into the coffee shop where they'd arranged to meet, carrying the kind of deliberate composure that meant something important. Was about to be said carefully. Your operative status is reinstated, Rourke said, conditional on a 6-month administrative review period, during which you'll be assigned to case analysis rather than fieldwork. She paused. There will be people who believe the condition should be more significant. I argued otherwise. I want you to know that. Thank you. The review period isn't punishment. It's the institution protecting itself while it figures out what to do with what I did, Genevieve said. I understand that. Rourke looked at her for a moment. What are you going to do? The case analysis. 6 months. And then she stopped. I don't know yet. I'm still working on the yet. She wasn't lying. The yet was genuinely unresolved, a space in her own future she'd cleared out by burning the previous version to the ground, and she hadn't decided what to put in it. It wasn't an uncomfortable space exactly. It was just empty, in a way that required her to keep looking at it rather than filling it too fast. She saw Lucian once, in the 5th week. It wasn't arranged. She was walking out of Rourke's building on a gray Tuesday afternoon, and he was standing on the sidewalk across the street, in a coat she didn't recognize, which told her he'd been careful about being here. No car, no visible security, nothing that announced him. Just a man on a sidewalk in a city full of men on sidewalk. She crossed the street. They stood looking at each other for a moment with the particular awkwardness of people whose shared experience has been too compressed and too extreme to produce any normal social grammar. The council made its decision, he said. I heard. Rourke had mentioned it. The syndicate's primary council had voted to restructure its organizational leadership, which was the political language of the fact that Lucian had retained his position and Arthur's faction had been dismantled. How is that? Complicated. He said it without effect. There are elements of the organization's financial structure I'm dismantling. It's going to take time and it's going to cost what it costs. He looked at her steadily. The right thing to do. She looked at him. You're telling me that specifically. I'm telling you because you'd want to know and because you'd find out anyway, and I'd rather you hear it directly. A pause. Also because it's true. She looked at the street for a moment, at the Tuesday afternoon traffic and the gray November sky, and the city going about its business the way it always did, indifferent to the specific things happening inside the people moving through it. The review period is 6 months, she said. Case analysis, not field work. I know. After that, I don't know what I'm doing. I know that too. She looked back at him. There's a financial security consulting framework I've been thinking about. Independent, working with corporate clients, and occasionally federal agencies on financial crime detection, using what I know in a structure I control. She hadn't said it out loud before. It was the first time the yet had taken a specific shape. It would require building something from nothing. You've done that before, he said. Undercover. That's different, is it? She looked at him for a long moment. At the man who'd put his hand at her back in a ballroom and called her his fiancée and meant neither of them to survive the night with it and had changed the architecture of everything by making that choice. Who'd handed her access to records that exposed his own organization because the alternative was Arthur winning, and the alternative after that was Hale winning. And some calculations had only one answer when you followed them far enough. Who was standing on a sidewalk outside a federal building on a gray Tuesday afternoon, with no car and no security because he'd wanted to see her, and she understood that precisely. I'm not the same person who walked into the Meridian Hotel, she said. No, he agreed, neither am I. I need the 6 months, she said. Figure out what comes after it. I know, I'm not saying. She stopped, started again. I'm not closing anything. I'm saying I need time to find out who I am when I'm not undercover and not in a crisis, because I haven't been that person in long enough that I've forgotten what she looks like. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She looks like the person standing in front of me." She breathed. 6 months, she said. 6 months. He agreed. She turned and walked back toward Rourke's building. And she didn't look back. Not because she didn't want to, but because some choices are made fully or not at all. And she'd learned something about that in the last 36 hours that she intended to keep. She thought he was still standing there. She didn't verify it. Kept walking. The 6 months passed the way recovery passes, not linearly, not smoothly, with reversals and plateaus and the occasional morning where she woke up and couldn't immediately remember who she was supposed to be that day, which turned out to be the most clarifying part. You learned yourself fastest in the moments before the performance had a chance to start. She built the consulting framework in month 3. Working evenings and weekends around the case analysis, this was genuinely demanding. Someone had decided to give her the complex cases, which was either Rourke's doing or the institution's way of acknowledging that whatever the administrative review was about, it wasn't about her competence. She registered the firm in month 5, independent, her real name on the documentation. Chen, the journalist Lucien had mentioned, contacted her in month 4, not about the investigation, which was still under active proceedings and off limits, but about financial crime detection methodology in general. They had 3 conversations over 2 months that were entirely professional and occasionally useful, and once produced a half-page note from Chen that read like the beginning of something Genevieve filed for a future she hadn't entirely defined yet. Hale's trial date was set for 14 months after his resignation. She was on the witness list. She kept the appointment with herself the 6 months, the case analysis, the patient process of reassembling something that looked like a life out of the rubble of the one she'd been maintaining under a name that wasn't hers. On the last day of the review period, Rourke signed the documentation that returned her to full operative status. She shook Rourke's hand and walked out of the building and stood on the same sidewalk where she'd stood 6 months earlier on a gray Tuesday and looked at the city. It was spring now. The quality of light different, warmer, less indifferent. Her phone was in her coat pocket. She took it out and looked at it for a moment. Then she sent a text. Review period ended today. The response came in under a minute. "I know. I've been watching the calendar." She looked at that for a moment. At the honesty of it, the uncomplicated acknowledgement of something that in another register might have been embarrassing to admit. She'd learned to recognize that as one of his specific qualities, the willingness to say the true thing without dressing it as something else. She typed, "I've figured out what comes after. Tell me." She looked at the city, the firm she'd registered, consulting framework, the yet that had finally taken the shape she'd been waiting for. Over dinner, she typed, "If you're available." The pause before his response was shorter than she expected. "Tonight," he wrote back. She put her phone in her pocket. She started walking. Not back toward Rourke's building, not toward the cover apartment she'd long since vacated, not toward any location that had been assigned to her or built for a role she was no longer playing. She walked in the direction she wanted to go, through a city that was indifferent to her, the way cities were indifferent to everyone and intimate with everyone. At the same time, and for the first time, in longer than she could calculate, the woman walking through it was the same one who existed when nobody was watching. That was the thing nobody told you about undercover work, not the danger, not the moral weight of prolonged deception, not the difficulty of maintaining a fabricated identity under sustained pressure. Those things they prepared you for. What they didn't prepare you for was how long it took after to recognize yourself in a mirror without looking for the role first. She'd been Marlowe for 8 months. She'd been something without a name for the 6 months after that. Now she was Genevieve Sinclair, walking toward dinner on a spring evening in a city that had tried to swallow her whole and hadn't quite managed it. That was enough. That was, she thought, exactly enough. The dinner was at a restaurant she'd chosen, not one of his, not anywhere connected to anything either of them had been before. A small Italian place in the West Village, with 8 tables and a chalkboard menu, and the kind of lighting that was warm without being deliberate about it. She'd made the reservation under her real name, which still felt like a small act of declaration every time she did it. He was already there when she arrived, which surprised her. She'd expected him to be the kind of man who arrived exactly on time as a form of control. Instead, he was at the corner table with a glass of water and no phone visible, and when she walked in, he looked up and didn't perform anything, no smile calibrated for the occasion, no careful arrangement of his expression. Just looked at her the way he'd looked at her since the beginning, with that full and unmediated attention she'd never entirely gotten used to. She sat down. "You chose the table," she said. "Corner. Sightlines to the door and the kitchen exit." He said it without self-consciousness. "Old habits." "Same reason I would have picked it," she said. They looked at each other, and something in the air between them settled, the specific settling of people who have stopped pretending they don't know what the other one is. Spain. She told him about the firm, the consulting framework, financial crime detection, working with corporate clients on the front end, and occasionally with independent oversight bodies on the investigative side. Not federal, not anywhere inside the apparatus that Hale had inhabited and hollowed out. Something she controlled, built from what she actually knew rather than what she'd been assigned to know. He listened the way he always listened, completely, without interrupting, tracking every detail. "It'll take 2 years to build a real client base," she said. "Probably. I've got enough saved to sustain it through the first 18 months if the early contracts are thin." "They won't be thin," he said. "You're good at this. You don't know that. I watched you reconstruct a $40 million fraud trail in 3 hours from a secondary office, using records you'd never seen before." He picked up his water glass. "I know that." She looked at him. "There's a conflict of interest question." "Yes. If I'm running an independent financial crime consulting operation, and I have a personal relationship with someone whose organization has been adjacent to federal investigations, I know what the question is. I'm asking whether you've thought about what it costs." He set the glass down. "I've spent 6 months dismantling the parts of my operation that can't survive legitimate scrutiny. The financial restructuring is documented and filed with 2 independent accounting firms. The council has been restructured with oversight provisions I've never had before." He paused. "I'm not going to tell you it's clean. I'm going to tell you it's cleaner than it was, and that the direction is fixed." "Why?" He looked at her steadily. "Because the alternative was being a man you couldn't sit across a table from." The room was quiet around them. Other tables, other conversations, the ordinary sound of people having ordinary evenings. She breathed. "Hale's trial," she said. "I'm on the witness list." "I know. My testimony is going to be thorough. Everything I documented, everything I observed, everything that happened in the 36 hours from the gala to Rourke's building." She held his gaze. "Everything. I know that too, and you're still here." "I'm still here," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had made a choice in a service corridor with police sirens building outside and his most trusted lieutenant running an armed coup in the next room, who had put his hand at her back and called her his fiancée and meant it as protection and had not entirely been wrong, who had handed her the records that exposed his own organization because some calculations had only one honest answer, who had stood on a sidewalk in November with no security and no performance. Just a man who'd been watching a calendar. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "Whatever this is. I've been undercover or in recovery from undercover for so long that I genuinely don't know how I function in an ordinary situation." "This isn't ordinary," he said. "No," she agreed. "But it's real, and I haven't had real in a long time." He looked at her with that quality she'd never fully categorized, not warmth exactly, not the performed kind, but something underneath warmth, structural version of it. "Neither have I." The food came, and they ate and they talked, not about Hale, not about the trial, not about the organization or the case or the 36 hours that had broken everything open. They talked about other things, smaller things. Oh, the kinds of things that 2 people who have survived something together talk about when they've agreed to try existing in the space after it. She told him about a book she'd read during the review period that had made her furious, for reasons she still couldn't fully articulate. He told her about a trip he'd taken to Portugal 20 years ago that he'd never gone back to and still thought about. It was ordinary in the way that things are ordinary when they're actually happening to you, rather than being observed from a professional distance. And she let it be that. When they walked out into the spring night, afterward, The city was doing its indifferent, intimate thing around them, the noise and the light and the 10,000 simultaneous private lives moving through the same shared space. They stood on the sidewalk, and she looked up at the sky, which was the particular New York version of a night sky, more orange than black. The city's light pushing back against the dark, a handful of stars visible if you looked specifically for them. "I'm not his fiancée anymore," she said. "No," a pause. "You never were." "I was whatever I needed to be to get through that room." "So was I," she looked at him. "What am I now?" He looked back at her, and the answer in his face was the answer she'd been circling for 6 months, without letting herself land on it. Not a role, not a function, not a position in someone else's architecture. Just a person. His person, in the specific and irreducible way that two people become that to each other after they have been through something real together and chosen to stay. "You're Genevieve Sinclair," he said. "That's enough." She looked at him for a moment. Then she took his hand, not the way a fiancé takes a hand for an audience, not the way an operative positions herself for cover. Just took it, the real version, the weight of it in hers. They walked. The city carried on around them, which it would keep doing, long after this particular night was over, long after every part of what had happened was resolved, or unresolved, or something in between. That was the thing about cities, they didn't mark the moments, held them, briefly, in the ambient noise and light, and then moved on. She didn't need it marked. She had the hand in hers, and the spring air and the woman she'd become walking through a city that had tried to consume her. And that was more than she'd expected when she'd put on an expensive dress and walked into a ballroom 8 months ago. Thinking she knew exactly what she was doing, she hadn't known. She knew now. That was enough.